Thank you very much for your introduction. It's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you again at this conference. I think the previous talk has given some proximity of what we are going to be dealing with in here. Since this conference has a general title, a methodological conference, so this is basically what the last talk gave a hint of, and this is actually what I will mainly focus on. I have decided to name the talk Philosophy of Mind as Philosophy in Science. Before we actually develop more on the theme, I will have to give a bit of a historical background and maybe explain some terms, because this will make it easier for us to understand what we really mean by all these terms. So first, let me give a short outline of my presentation. I will try to, maybe for some of you it may be an obvious term, what philosophy in science is. I'd like to make it more explicit anyway, and then I'll try to show the origins of philosophy, the origins especially as seen in the philosophy, in physics, because here in Poland, in Kraków, we do it in a fairly special way. We can call it in some ways in Kraków School of the Philosophy of Nature. I'll get into that in a moment. And then I will try to move over to more methodological remarks and say how does philosophy in science work, just to give a brief account of its method. Then I will show you some example in physics. And the reason I'm hung up on physics here, because I come from a background of more of a physics. As far as neuroscience and neurobiology, I can say I'm a bit of a new kid in town, but I think I can use some experience from doing philosophy in physics and see how it can be sort of implemented as a philosophy, as doing philosophy of mind, as a philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences. This will be my main point. And so actually what I'll do here is I'll try to shift the ground from talking about philosophy of physics to talking about philosophy of mind, understood as philosophy done in the context of cognitive sciences. That will be my main goal in this talk, and see what we come up with. Basically to say whether we can do the same or there are limitations. And I think as I approach the subject, I think I came into some interesting conclusions, and those are methodological and especially interesting for those who are trying to see what assumptions are made, especially if we do such science as cognitive sciences, right? Because we're interested in a bit of a background of what kind of assumptions we're dragging into the field. So let me move over to answer the question, what is philosophy in science? And of course this is a bit of a review of the history of science. We're looking at the scientific revolution of the 17th century, where actually science and philosophy split apart. They developed different methodologies, and especially in some context of different ecclesiastical discussions, we see an emphasis of distinct methodological planes, scientific and philosophical. Scientific method understood, here again I excuse myself for talking physics, but this is the closest to me it's the closest to what I understand, is that we have a planned experiment in mathematics. So we plan some, I mean, you all know what I mean when we design an experiment and then use mathematics to, let's say, formulate laws which we say govern nature in very broad terms. And philosophy is more of a qualitative description and conceptual analysis. So we have, apparently we can say we have very different methodologies. But then it's not always like that. In many cases it mixes, especially that scientists and philosophers use the same mind. I don't believe we have a philosophical mind and we have a scientific mind. We have one mind, period. And this conviction makes me think that really some closer connections need to be made. And of course, I relate here more to the idea of philosophy in science as exercised here in Kraków in our center. And really one can see that philosophy of science has grown out of the practice of scientists. Doing science provokes philosophical questions. And I see it as a philosopher of physics that in many cases talking about the universe as a whole, for example, will provoke some philosophical questions of very general nature. So actually we can try and exercise the philosophy of nature in different scientific disciplines. Of course, it exists in physics, it exists in biology, as we have heard 15 minutes ago. It's much less in chemistry, but I think there's some works being done there too. And fourth, please be patient, which means we will turn to cognitive science in a moment. And in Poland, philosophy in science especially has its motivation from the Lviv-Warsaw School on Philosophy and the Krakow School of Philosophy of Nature, led by Professor Michał Heller. And what I want to make a remark that philosophy in science is not the same as philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is generally a reflection on the method of science, but philosophy in science is, as you will be, as you see, something completely different. I can probably point out to some more philosophical motivations of a broader sense. Usually we recall Karl Popper and his theory-ladenness of experiment, as well as Quine and especially his denial of the two dogmas of empiricism. This is sort of what sits in the background of philosophy in science, why the two things mix and we no longer observe the division of the methodological planes. There are a lot of physicists who point out to the importance of philosophy. One of them is a quite known Italian physicist Rovelli, who has done some interesting work on the quantum group in the quantum gravity, especially in the loop quantum gravity, and he says the following: I am convinced of the reciprocal usefulness of a dialogue between physics and philosophy. This dialogue has played a major role during other periods in which science faced foundational problems. And I don't want to say that cognitive sciences face foundational problems, but I think they are very much in a state of consolidating their methodology. So I expect that some philosophical reflection could be very useful. And returning to physics, he say, in my opinion, most physicists underestimate the effect of their own epistemological prejudices on the research, and many philosophers underestimate the influence, either positive or negative, they have on fundamental research. On the one hand, a more acute philosophical awareness would greatly help physicists engage in fundamental research. Newton, Heisenberg, and Einstein could not have done what they did if they were not nurtured by good or bad, and I think it's an important remark, philosophy. On the other hand, I wish that contemporary philosophers concerned with science would be more interested in the foundational problems that science is facing today. So this much on a reflection of a, let's say, contemporary practicing physicist on how the relations between physics and philosophy can be perceived. And then I would like to present several key points which we think are summarizing the method. In other words, how philosophy in science works. So first of all, we could say and see how some philosophical ideas influence the origin and evolution of scientific theories. The history of science has seen few good examples of such a scenarios. For example, the famous Clark-Leibniz debate, Bohr-Einstein debate, or the contemporary Hawking-Penrose debate, which actually I will show you in a moment, are telling us that philosophical assumptions can actually give or set a very distinct direction of how the theory, scientific theory, is eventually constructed. And then the other way, some traditional philosophical problems are involved in empirical theories. So, for example, such very well-known and intuitive notions as time, space, causality, and matter are appearing very frequently in physics. But what physics does, we will see in a moment, is physics purifies and gives them a more formal expression. But these notions do survive. So please remember, because I'll use that later on in cognitive sciences, that some traditional problems involved in empirical theories in physics, they do survive. We'll see something else later on. And the third point is that doing philosophy and science gives us an opportunity to make philosophical reflection on the assumptions of the empirical sciences. That point will turn out to be important for us as well in a moment. And then I was showing this slide a year ago, and I'll try to let this physicist speak again, how Stephen Hawking describes why his philosophical standpoint is so much different than that of Roger Penrose. Hawking says, "We now have very different approaches to the world, physical and mental." Basically, he is, Roger Penrose, a Platonist, believing that there is a unique world of ideas that describes a unique physical reality. I, on the other hand, am a positivist who believes that physical theories are just mathematical models we construct, and that it is meaningless to ask whether they correspond to reality, just whether they predict observations. So this single quote shows you that there can be physicists who are leading physicists of contemporary times, but they explicitly declare very different philosophical standpoints, and they involve both ontological and epistemological assumptions. I mean, I would have to explore more on what these things are, but believe me, for now, they're very, very philosophically distinct attitudes. And the next slide is showing you just several aspects of the work of Hawking and Penrose, which we believe are the effect of different philosophical assumptions. So these are, for example, their diverse conclusions on the initial conditions in the Big Bang. Hawking says, in his typical non-boundary proposal, and Penrose has the Veil curvature hypothesis. Very different approaches. Space-time geometry. Hawking says that the geometry of the universe is closed as required by the non-boundary proposal. Penrose says that the space-time geometry of the universe is open because it fits his hyperbolic geometry. Then we have the CPT invariance, which is a rule which we get from the field theory, and of course they differ in their conclusions here as well. And then the fourth problem, which is probably the leading problem of their controversy, is the problem of quantum theory, and especially of the measurement problem. Penrose will say that the reduction of the state vector must be a genuine physical process. Hawking will say that this question is absolutely irrelevant. So what I wanted to show is that doing philosophy in physics is bringing out a variety of problems which are of philosophical nature, and as you vary them, there are situations in which you end up with a very distinct results which are purely physical. So your physical theory just says something else. Okay, and now I will start slowly and shift towards what is of our interest. and start talking about philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind, we'll see what it means in a moment. But as a, let's say, as a practicing physicist and a philosopher of physics, what I was trying to do is to see if the same methodology can be shifted, and if the following is true. Since I say that I can do philosophy of physics as philosophy in the context of physical theories, so let me ask the question, if we can do philosophy of mind, and I still refrain from defining what it is, as philosophy in science, and this should mean doing philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences. Can we do something like this? Is that cut and paste sort of way possible? Do we get anything important, or is it, or we get lost? And let me start briefly explaining what I mean by all of this. And then if we sort of make a very stiff transcription of the methodology that I gave before into our new field, then we say that philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences should mean the following. How philosophical standpoints influence the character of the theories of mind. So for example, if we're starting to bring in the mind-body dualism, functionalism, all these different standpoints, especially in the relations of mind and body, do they influence how we approach constructing the theories of mind? And then the second thing is if we can shed any light on the classical problems, classical philosophical problems, in the light of the results of the cognitive sciences. And the third idea, which is, I think, will be quite important in the context of cognitive sciences, can we trace the assumptions? So, for example, how is that a mind can study a mind? That's another interesting problem. So, I mean, just transcribing would say, well, we have a project which is just start and execute, but it's not that simple. And I'll just will try to explain why. Because if we take any standard book which explains to us what cognitive sciences are, I'm using here a bit of an extended description given by the MIT Encyclopedia of Cognitive Sciences. We read the following, that cognitive sciences is a sort of a collection of different fields of study, and we get the following: philosophy, and I just added philosophy of mind because this is basically what interests us, psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, linguistics and language, cultural anthropology, and evolutionary sciences. I extended the list a little bit, but basically it covers what the MIT Encyclopedia tells us. So as you see, and this will be one of the major points, that contrary to philosophy of physics, philosophy of mind done in the context of cognitive sciences is not a unified field. You have a whole variety of different fields which are very specific. And the first question is how do you unite all of this? So that will be our first problem. And I have a reason why I put the question marks by philosophy. Because as you see, philosophy is somehow thrown into the bag, right? It's all like a huge mixed bag of things, and philosophy is just there too. And now the question will be whether we really need philosophy there, and whether it's useful or it's maybe harmful to have philosophy in that mixed bag of all these things. And now I would like to ask, just remind a little bit that the philosophy of mind is a very old philosophical discipline. Philosophers asked questions about the nature of anything that's connected with the mind, that is knowledge, acquisition, memory, perception, mental states, free will, qualia, consciousness, soul, and all these notions are very old notions. They derive from antique. They are notions that have been used for centuries. So that's actually nothing new. It's a very old legacy, very old tradition. And among those, the most important problem that is central for the philosophy of mind is the mind-body problem. And we're probably all aware of the fact that the classical solution that was given to that problem was given by René Descartes, and that's a substance dualism, that you have a separate substance of mind and body, right? So it's a very strong dualistic idea. And there's no doubt that this idea has dominated very much the Western thinking. Philosophy of mind, a blessing or a curse? Let's see what we can get out of that. If we leave philosophy in that whole entire list of the ingredients, so to say, of cognitive sciences, then immediately what happens is that cognitive sciences are, I wrote burdened, maybe I wrote too much, but cognitive sciences do inherit the old philosophical problems as fully legitimate knowledge. So in that bag you will all, for example, have all these different philosophical concepts like dualism just floating around there with everything else. And it may as well happen that these problems, in the light of contemporary cognitive science, can be pseudo-problems that do not arise from any cognitive results. Let me give an example here from the area of physics again. There's a very old Aristotelian theory which is called a hylomorphic theory, which says that everything is composed out of matter and form. And as you look at contemporary physics, you will find out very easily that physics does not know what matter is. When you open up any physics book, you'll see only formulas, which tells us that actually theoretical physics is actually the science of forms. We don't hear much about matter in physics anymore. So hylomorphic theory is something which is probably intuitive and common sense, but it doesn't come out as easily, if at all, in contemporary physics. So the question is if dragging this philosophical baggage is of any value for us. And there's another very touchy discipline of science and contemporary science, which is mathematics. And many of you probably have done mathematics, but probably many of you have not thought really how mathematics works. And there's a discipline called philosophy of mathematics, which is trying to explain the nature of mathematical ideas. So what it means, for example, to have an idea of an integral, right? What it means to have an idea of a derivative. I understand that most of you who work in neurosciences would do something like this, okay? Just cut open someone's head, hook up the electrodes or fMRI, whatever, have someone do the integral, and then part of the brain activates. Fine. That's definitely a legitimate approach. But there have been huge discussions in the area of mathematics, really what mathematics means. And if you open up any book on the history of philosophy of mathematics, you will find different positions on what is the ontological status of mathematical objects. And among those you have very famous Platonism, you have conceptualism, you have intuitionism, many very varying philosophical standpoints as to what the nature of mathematical objects is. And it turns out that they're all very strong philosophical assumptions. And recently we got interested in a certain approach to trying to kind of make a step back and see if these are really assumptions and you can explain them by looking at the theory of metaphors of George Lakoff. He wrote a book, Where Mathematics Came From, How the Embodied Mind Brings Mathematics into Being. Again, we have this word embodiment again. So this approach really, which we're sort of trying to look at to see how it's going to be useful for us, is definitely setting a very, I would say, strong division between philosophy and cognitive sciences, saying that cognitive science have a chance to expel all that curse of philosophical assumptions. And this is what Lakoff writes. The discrepancies between the findings of cognitive science, he understands basically the science of metaphors. So that's actually a very specific meaning, which probably deserves some further discussion, but I will skip that. The discrepancies between the findings of cognitive science and the folk theories, read philosophy, that's my remark, of the people whom cognitive sciences study is a particularly sensitive issue in the case of mathematics. The reason is that a great many of those who have a serious knowledge of mathematics not only tend to believe the mythology we call the romance of mathematics, but tend to believe it fiercely. The romance of mathematics is part of their worldview, their very identity. Since our findings generally contradict the romance, we would not be surprised to find that this book infuriated such people. So actually, what I believe he means here is definitely the different philosophies of mathematics, which are just philosophical assumptions into what mathematical objects are. And the claim here is that we can make a step back and explain why people arrived at such conceptualizations, for example, as Platonism. So, what are the problems that we are facing now as we try to sort out the situation as we exercise philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences? We have seen that philosophy in the context of physical theories absorbs the conceptual legacy of the classical philosophy of nature. The notions of time, space, causality remain. They're just given new, purified, and general expressions. Of course, this has its limits, because if, for example, we get into theory of quantum gravity, some of those may disappear, but that's another question. And the problem of philosophy in the context of cognitive science is much more complex. First of all, because as you have seen, many components of cognitive sciences have many components as opposed to one body of physics, which, I mean, has its areas too, but it's much more coherent. And then the second is the conceptual basis of these different components of cognitive sciences are very diverse. They derive from distinct paradigms of knowledge. For example, artificial intelligence or neuroscience has built up a very different conceptual basis as opposed to the philosophical one, especially as we start talking about the artificial intelligence and the computational paradigm. So here we get a problem in which our conceptual grounds are very different and mixed. So that gives us the source of problems we can be all seeing. Now, this is just to show how different some classical notions can be, but they still survive, like it is in physics. Causality understood classically, I mean, smashing someone's nose is just, I mean, what causality is. Someone just gets his nose damaged, there is a clear agent, there is a clear someone who's acted upon, so we understand causality very intuitively. As we switch to physics, causality survives, but it of course has a very different meaning. We understand, of course, causality in terms of light cones and things like that. And if we switch to general relativity, that would become a lot more complex as well. So this is just showing that in physics, some intuitive concepts survive. They get a very different meaning, but still the basic idea is pretty much the same. It gets purified and generalized. Now what I'll be trying to answer is, can we save philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences? Of course, what we need to do, that at least for now, I think philosophy cannot remain in the context of cognitive sciences as an ontological component, which would mean, for example, we cannot contemporarily we see that we cannot, for example, say that we take the mind-body dualism as a valid view of relation between mind and body. This is what simply does not come out for today. So what we have to do is we have to drop all the ontological commitments of whatever we had brought in with the philosophical baggage. This doesn't seem to be helping a contemporary cognitive scientists. So what we really think is that the role of philosophy is mainly methodological in that context, which would mean minimally to secure communication between disciplines involved. So it would tell us how to translate between the different fields that are involved in cognitive sciences. Because we can have a problem in communicating, let's say, between the computational paradigm and psychology. That's something that's difficult to communicate at the very beginning as well. So we need some translation rules that will be helping us to achieve communication even within cognitive sciences. I mean, I was even listening to those all interesting talks on psychology that were presented in here, and even within those, some terms were understood differently. And really, in order to make this compact and coherent, I think this is where philosophical reflection would help. So this is the minimal program. And maximal program, of course, would be to provide a common conceptual basis for all the disciplines involved. That's, of course, a much more difficult challenge, because we don't even know if it's possible. Maybe there is some meta level at which we can formulate a language which binds all of these. But at this moment, it's probably not really possible. So what we really would like to say is that philosophy should assure that cognitive sciences are an interdisciplinary program and not a multidisciplinary, in a sense that interdisciplinary says that there is some common ground, that at least there's some translational rules. Multidisciplinary would mean that it's just like it's like a mosaic, that you have this here, this here, this here, really without much communication and really without much of the sharing of the different results, and even being unable to translate results from one discipline to the other. So I think we should really be careful that the philosophy should secure that doing philosophy in the context of cognitive sciences is a really interdisciplinary project, because then we get a mutual understanding. And now I would like to point out to two examples of I would call them philosophers of mind, because this is actually how basically how they would name themselves. And actually this is because they use a lot of philosophy. The first of all is David Chalmers, who actually is someone who works in that mosaic paradigm. He takes some strong philosophical assumptions, like, for example, the assumption of the existence of qualia, the assumption of zombies, metaphysical assumption of multiverse, and treats them as legitimate starting points to do his science. For example, his use of the multiverse ontology in connection with quantum mechanics, I think, yields a very risky way of employing quantum mechanics to understand mind. So in that case, we could fall into the danger of legitimization of certain pseudo problems on a philosophical ground. I think much better methodology is exercised by another philosopher of mind, Dennett. He would be rather an example of someone who is doing more of an interdisciplinary studies. He makes relatively little philosophical assumptions and treats the different components of cognitive sciences, for example, evolutionary psychology of artificial intelligence, in a coherent enough framework that permits at least disputability of these different attitudes. I think his methodology is just a lot more secure, and at least that maybe some of these theses are controversial, but at least they're disputable. I mean, he's not sort of framing himself with very rigid philosophical assumptions, which are introduced in more of an axiomatic than disputable way. So these are the two different approaches, and I think generally Daniel Dennett as a figure in the philosophy of mind is much more of a, I mean, you can of course disagree with his different particular theories, but at least from a methodological point of view, I think he's much more coherent than Chalmers. Leaving those two aside, I would now like to take up one issue which in the philosophy of mind it comes often, even more often today, the question of free will. This is a very old notion which has been used in philosophy and ethics for centuries, and in the context of cognitive sciences is today very frequently asked, does free will exist? Because if we take free will understood classically, based on classical philosophers, we will say that free agent is someone who acts without a cause, someone who acts undetermined. From my, I would say maybe a bit of a preliminary readings in some of the theories of mind in cognitive sciences, mind can be considered as a causal machine. What would that mean? It would mean that if we eventually develop a coherent theory of mind, so practically the only model of theory that contemporary science has is a theory that's completely deterministic, in a sense that mind ultimately can be considered as a causal machine, which of course is to be understood in a sense of the contemporary causality. And there's a way of, I mean, there's a standpoint which is called compatibilism, which hopes to reconcile free will with the determinism of the brain. I may be mixing the words a little bit, but let's move on. And actually, if we don't have a free will, then we run into a very major problem. We have difficulty explaining morality. We have difficulty explaining responsibility. We have difficulty explaining culpability. And then the last question is, we may maybe do we need lawyers at all? Then, I mean, that's a basic problem if free will does not exist. I mean, cognitive sciences do know experiments which were considered to point out that there isn't any free will. For example, Libet experiments, but those have been criticized quite heavily. And what I would, that's actually a bit of my own attitude, my own idea, that maybe there is something like that we can, in that context, just to save a compatibilism, we can say that free will exists subjectively as perceived by the one who wills, but objectively the brain functions entirely deterministically. And to describe such a theory of mind, maybe it would be useful to use some contemporary theories of chaos, especially of the deterministic chaos, meaning that the mind perceives the process of willing as uncaused. It's how it's perceived. By actually, on the physical basis, or the basis of the brain, the willing is caused. So there's probably a bit of a ground to start to reconcile these very far lying notions. I mean, we have just as we look at the theories of the brain, and then as we look at the nature of the philosophical notions of free will, we see how far apart we are. But actually, maybe there is some ways of correlating the two. And since my time is probably running to an end, I'll try to give you some conclusions. So philosophy of mind as philosophy exercised in the context of cognitive sciences, as compared to philosophy in physics, faces new important challenges. Especially cognitive sciences are multi-component. As we have seen, there's many different, actually different kinds of natural sciences being involved. And then we have seen also that the conceptual bases are quite diverse. It's very hard to move, let's say, between the language of artificial intelligence and between the language, let's say, of psychology. I think that's quite difficult. And then eventually, as we've seen many philosophical barriers being broken, here, if we really want to enter into the relation of mind, body and mind, in the theory of all of this, actually, what are we doing? We are breaking the subjective-objective dualism, which is actually the fortress of the Western thought. So if we introduce entirely physicalist approaches, then we break the subjective-objective dualism, which is very much ingrained in our method of thought. It is of a Western thought, because the Eastern will be a lot different. So basically, the Western thought is based on that dualism, and if we're trying to explain away the mind, for example, we are breaking a very, very stiff barrier. And the functional philosophy needs to be shifted, at least for now, from ontological assumptions to the methodological ones. Well, one more. I mean, my feeling as a physicist is that actually in cognitive sciences, we are basically using the same method. We're using a theory. And that's the only tool of analysis, and maybe that's a limiting thing. And here we again hit the question that the methodological specificity of a scientific theory is showing us, in case of cognitive sciences, a very high level of incompatibility with that of a philosophical inquiry, because the methodology is so different and the conceptual bases are so far apart. But I would like to end with one challenge to cognitive science, because actually, whether we assume dualism or physicalism, whatever else, it will be interesting if we can see if cognitive science can make a step back and to see if we can provide scientific explanations for why the human mind conceptualizes as it does. So, for example, why all the philosophers came up, especially of the Platonic breed, came with a very strong dualism. Why Descartes came up with the dualist view of mind and body. Are there any scientific grounds to justify these kind of assumptions? There can be a good chance those are good projects for cognitive sciences. Maybe some of this research is being done. I'm not, as I said, I'm a bit of a new into the field. So maybe someone will have already good ideas in that matter, but I think it will be very interesting to justify some of the major philosophical assumptions that are running in the philosophy of mind, to see if we can make a step back, if by using cognitive research understand better why human mind conceptualizes as it does. That would be my last incentive, last point to make in that presentation. I would like to thank Mateusz Chochol, a graduate student, a very good colleague of mine, for providing good insights into that talk. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank both speakers. No, not to jump yet. We do have a few minutes of discussion. Both speakers actually illustrate the need to, I don't know if it's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I have a remark on that, to combine together disciplines of philosophy with cognitive sciences or neurosciences. It depends on the point of view. And I will take the challenge and start with 3 very brief questions or remarks or whatever wish, and then it's open for discussion. And we have 10 minutes for discussion, and then we shift into a round table, which is not round. First technical remark to you. You mentioned that one of the arguments, I think Tomasello wrote it, against the or evolutionary processes in the development of rules is that the genetic differences between primates is very small. This is, I think, utterly incorrect. We think that the genetic difference is very small because we think linearly in terms of the structure of the genes, but we know so little about what the genetic material means that to say that 90, I don't remember the number, let's say 98.5% of the genes of a chimpanzee are same as human beings attest only to the person who, yeah, we don't know how the regulation works, so we don't know actually where the multiplication forks are and so on and so on, but this is cited, so that's correct. So the second issue relates to supervenience. I somehow find it difficult to follow arguments that use supervenience because, as I understand it, it means that things are related, but one A or B does not ensue A. So this cannot serve as an explanation, only as a description. So this is to you, and then I had a third remark here, so, and then I shut up. So, sure.
As regards the first remark, it may well be, I don't know, but it does not influence very much the argument I was trying to make, of course, because the crux of the argument is that it's very striking for me that there are three completely different ways of approaching the problem I'm interested in, that is a philosophical analysis, some evolutionary scenario, and some, let's say, neuroscientific model that converge in an interesting way. I don't know, as I said, whether it's true or not, but it's extremely interesting for me. That's why I wanted to present it here. The second thing, the notion of supervenience, surely it does not describe any causal connections. It's just it's much logically much weaker than a causal connection. But there are more problems involved here. Usually, when you define supervenience, there are different kinds of supervenience: local supervenience, global supervenience. These are defined in the language of the second-order logic. This means that it is usually defined, like by Kim and some other philosophers, as the relation between properties, and the properties are represented in the second-order language as predicate letters. So it is said that a predicate, that some property supervenes on some other property only in the case when this subvening changes, the supervening changes in the corresponding way. But this would not do for what I suggested here. I believe that one would need to develop a different kind of the notion of supervenience in order to say that rules supervene on interactions of social interactions and some mental phenomena. I believe that a good idea would be to develop the so-called supervenience of structures. Because in second-order logic is a very precisely defined structure. But if we generalize a bit the concept of supervenience, we may try to say that there is a supervenient and subvenient structure, and we can try to trace some connections between them. So I said technically supervenience, but in fact it wasn't supervenience as it is defined in the logical literature right now. We would need a more powerful concept probably.
Okay, so supervenience here is just a heuristic, which means you use it now, but with the hope that it will lead you to some more tight. So it's prerogative of the chair. I shut up in a minute. Two remarks for you to your talk that I remember now. Only one of them. Well, two. First of all, I think there is a very big difference between cognitive sciences and physics in that in cognitive sciences or in biology in general, you refer to that, there are no theories. There are no theories. That's, I think it's a sort of a usage of the word which is a bit sort of a hybrid on the side of the biologists that they call these theories. For example, we say the theory of evolution. It's not a theory, it's a model, because there is no quantitative base for that. There is no relationship that could be quantified, and so on and so on. The only close to theories issues that I know in my field are rules, and there are very few of them. Like, for example, we have the Hebbian rule. It doesn't matter whether it's Hebb or James or whoever did it. It's a rule that can be even quantified, and you say if X and Y are such and such. Or in learning theory, again theory, which is not the right term, there is Scholar Wagner, which is, I think, the only rule, quantitative rule we follow in, correct me, Joe, or others, in memory research. All the other rules that we are so proud of discussing in terms of, let's say, the role of reward and so on, so they all follow from this Scholar Wagner rule, which is the only rule I know, but it's not a theory. So this is one major difference that I see, that in philosophy of physics, which for me, philosophy of science, when I talk to people or when I see what they write, usually is philosophy of physics. And there is reason for that, because there are theories of physics, so you can philosophize. We are probably at the stage in the life, that's my view, we are probably at the stage in the life sciences and in cognitive sciences where we are far away from that stage where we can generalize and we can, so. And the second remark is more practical. You say you would like the philosophy, and I admire that wish, to lead to interdisciplinary approach in cognitive sciences. And you're right. If we list the sub-disciplines in cognitive sciences, we get even more than you wrote there. It's not a problem, because many people would claim we are doing cognitive sciences, anthropology and psychology and so on and so on. But I find a caveat here, and you said we want it to be interdisciplinary because we need. We didn't say because. We need translation rules, which I utterly agree with you. Without translation rules in our disciplines, even between electrophysiology and behavior, we wouldn't be able to proceed. But the issue with interdisciplinarity is that it also connotes the fact that you don't have to master one discipline as we know it now in depth. And I think it's a problem, because we have new programs which are interdisciplinary programs, and we generate students who are very smart, but then at the end of the day, there isn't even a single cognitive science discipline that they know enough to contribute. So this is my only remark. The idea is fine. I just am using here a comment on the term. And that's
if I may answer, I think that it's not that we it's not that we pick up on looking what doing philosophy as a philosophy in the context of cognitive science may do because we have nothing better to do. But I think we are forced to do that because the philosophical issues that are tied to these problems are so pregnant. I mean, I think they're actually much more pregnant than problems of physics. And much more actually touching on even an idea like of even what the human person is. I mean, it's much close. It's much more like intimate to us. So I think these problems will be chasing us if we like or no. So I think I mean, in philosophy, physics is sort of a bit of a comfort, right? Because it's farther away. It's a universe somewhere far away. But here, I think the problems that were raised by philosophy are so important, and so much depends on it, as far as morality, as far as ethics, as far as issues of life. And then, if a discipline like artificial intelligence develops, which takes up very boldly these problems, I mean, I think we are very much in a much more tense situation than in philosophy of physics. I think the project is fairly urgent, although it's much more difficult.
I agree it's urgent. I think that what you said sort of boils down to the fact that when, I may be wrong, but my feeling is that when you practice philosophy of physics, you practice philosophy of issues that are usually very intriguing, very important, but not in the meso world in which we work. And for us, the philosophy of mind is something that we encounter every day.
Yes.
There are very few people who wake up in the morning, unless they are tenured professors at physics departments, who wake up in the morning and say, how was the world created? Unless they are religious. But in the case of philosophy of mind, we sort of encounter that on a daily basis if we don't want to, like the law, for example. So these were my remarks, and I should give an opportunity to people to
Yes, at some point in your talk, you ask a question, the question, how can mind investigate or study the mind? Well, I don't think there is a circular phenomenon in this question. I don't, I'm not in any way involved in that science, but to study mind, you study mind in general. You don't study your own mind, but you can make experiments to study some other people's minds. And
yeah, you have a third-person perspective, yes, exactly. Well, I was just, it was more of a rhetorical remark to make, that really to point out how close we get. Because actually what's intriguing is that actually if we want to construct, let's say, a theory of mind, then that theory is also a theory of our mind. So we're sort of getting very close in that. I mean, we can have a theory of a universe, of a theory of, I don't know, I don't know, electron transfer or something like this. But here, I think if all these issues are supposed to emerge somewhere, I think, again, this is what we just talked before. These borders are getting very close and are getting very intimate. And I think this is the message that I want to get across.
We'll take the last question from the audience, and then after this last question, we have the last break, which is 5 minutes, not more, and then we'll have the last session, which is a short roundtable. So if there is a last question, unless you wish to wait for the roundtable, yeah,
This
please.
is a question. I very much like the idea that you phrased as philosophy in science, and I take that to mean that philosophers and scientists join forces to try and understand our subject matter. And I was wondering if over the course of the last 2 days, as we've talked about emotion and neuroscience and psychology and so forth of emotion, examples of where philosophers could come in and help us in our work.
Well, when I was listening, especially the first day of our conferences, I mean, these were a very fine, you know, solid, excellent, solid research in psychology, and I was just really asking myself a lot of questions. How can a philosopher come in and ask a legitimate question in that context? And this sort of, I think, it still shows that although research in psychology has explained so much, I, as a philosopher, still did have a problem of asking, let's say, a question that makes sense. I mean, I could be, in general, I could know what emotions are. Generally, I could, you know, from a philosophical point of view, as I said, try to understand if, for example, a certain stimuli can be shown as correlates of some states of mind. I mean, this is all clear, but just to get nearer some philosophical issues, I think we still have to. I mean, at least achieve some more common ground of discussion. That was my feeling, actually, when I was listening. I was appreciating a lot what's done in psychology, but it was for me quite, maybe I'm wrong, but it was quite difficult for me to actually to see where I can hook up philosophy in a very, I would say, in a deep sense, right? The only thing that really does come up is, as we have seen yesterday, that actually and this is, I think, what a philosopher could say, is that psychology functions entirely in the sort of monist context, and that's, I mean, dualism doesn't come out in a sense that we will have most of the cognitive sciences and psychologists agree that, you know, let's say mind is at the most the function of a brain, and actually we basically can explain the most in terms of physical, understand biological description. So that's nothing wrong, because this shows us the method that's what is called a methodological naturalism. So science explains things by scientific means. So I think there's already a great deal of methodological reflection that can be made.